in a lot of these hard to decarbonize sectors, you really need to take a little bit of a pragmatic approach. So like, what are the things that we need to do to get financing, to get the new technology in place so we can really start reducing like in that sector's emissions. So in this case, it's SAF, it's new aircraft or whatever it is. But what are other things that can be done sort of in the interim before that gets to scale that can actually still address emissions? Because at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of like companies looking at their emissions, kind of like splitting out country by country, et cetera. But emissions are global. Like, we're talking about global climate change, global emissions. Like, what do we need to do to reduce it? So I think it's a little bit of, you know, what can we do within the sector with technology, and what can we do that's outside of the sector that in some cases is not going to be a direct, one-to-one for whatever is happening within your organization, your country, your sector, whatever it is. But ultimately, the math and the ledger, what we're trying to get to here is global.
All right, everyone. Welcome back to This Week in Carbon. I'm your host, Eddie Smith, alongside my bestie, Rene Velasquez, our carbon market overlord. And today we have our, amazing guest and a good friend, Stephanie Zhu, head of climate at Yum Brands and former sustainability and climate leader at Delta Airlines for over a decade. So thanks for joining us, Stephanie. What's been going on?
Thanks for having me. Okay. Did we not record any of that cold open?
No, we did.
Oh,
we did.
It's recording right now. It's been recording since you joined.
I was just checking. Okay.
It's all good. How's it going? What's going on lately? What have you been up to? Anything good?
Just working. It is May, which means in the corporate
start of May.
It's the start of May, which means Q1, Q2, we are heavy on reporting and that kind of thing right now.
Heavy on reporting. Okay. And Rene, anything exciting going on your end? You're in
I'm trying to enjoy a little bit of an R&R here with my family. We're in Desaru. So excuse the business center that I'm in.
You're not hotel. Not the typical amazing desk background that tried to copy here with my plant that I bought from home.
No, sterile yellow light. But yeah. Anyway, thanks for having me, Eddie.
Of course.
It's good to be on a podcast with Stephanie. This is the best. I'm excited.
No, this is amazing. I love the energy. But yeah, we've got some good topics to get into. I think the first one, it'd be good to talk about, I think, aviation, which is highly relevant and on a lot of people's mind in the industry. So there's a story from the Financial Times recently about European airline emissions, and they're set to exceed pre-pandemic levels in 2024 and 2025, according to new forecasts by the Transport and Environment Commission. So this highlights the aviation sector's struggle to decarbonize, right? Despite industry pledges to reach net zero by 2050 through SAF, carbon trading, and improved efficiency, progress has stalled due to high SAF costs, low production levels, and limited policy incentives. So airline executives are now lobbying in the EU to delay or ease climate regulations, arguing that targets for SAF blending are currently unrealistic and that the EU and UK carbon pricing schemes are too expensive compared to international alternatives like CORSIA. So we're seeing European airline emissions rebound beyond 2019 levels post-pandemic, while net zero commitments remain in place. Is this a policy failure, a technology lag, or both? I mean, what's going on here? It seems like it's quite obvious that the aviation sector globally will not be able to decarbonize in the next 25 years unless, the offsets are widely accepted. How do you interpret this? What are your thoughts on this situation?
I mean, okay, so having worked in aviation sustainability for a little bit over a decade, it is categorized as a hard to decarbonize sector. So the solutions that are needed to essentially reduce emissions, some of them are not at scale. Like SAF is definitely getting there. The price parity, I think, is an issue.
Mm,
And I think it is just going to be a hard to decarbonize sector with lots of hurdles that we've seen. So, and I think part of it is, and this is my personal opinion, that in a lot of these hard to decarbonize sectors, you really need to take a little bit of a pragmatic approach. So, like, what are the things that we need to do to get financing, to get the new technology in place so we can really start reducing, like, in that sector's emissions? So in this case, it's SAF, it's new aircraft or whatever it is. But
mm,
what are other things that can be done sort of in the interim before that gets to scale that can actually still address emissions? Because at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of like companies looking at their emissions, kind of like splitting out country by country, et cetera. But emissions are global. Like, we're talking about global
mm.
climate change, global emissions. Like, what do we need to do to reduce it? So I think it's a little bit of, you know, what can we do within the sector with technology, and what can we do that's outside of the sector that in some
Yeah,
cases is not going to be a direct, one-to-one for whatever is happening within your organization, your country, your sector, whatever it is. But ultimately, the math and the ledger, what we're trying to get to here is
yeah.
global, addressing global.
Global, right? We all share
Yeah.
the same atmosphere. Some folks have argued, oh, we should fly less, but obviously that's not going to happen given the essential role that flying plays in the global economy for, cargo and shipping of commodities and essential goods and services. But yeah, Renee, you've obviously had experience working with some of the biggest airlines in the world on decarbonization and also helping launch the aviation carbon exchange. We've, run multiple workshops with airline coalitions and NGOs. What's your take on this situation, right? I mean, how do you interpret the tension between sustainability targets and commercial realities?
It's a difficult reality, Hedy. Stephanie highlighted it, right? And I had the pleasure of working with Stephanie and her team when she was at Delta, and I saw it firsthand. Airlines, so the industry accounts for between 2 to 3%, and I think that is increasing as the airline sector continues to grow and there's more and more air travel. But let's just peg it at 3 to 4% of total global emissions, and it is really difficult to abate. Just the physics of it. The airline industries need fuels, hydrocarbons with that fuel density to get literally off the ground. It's this the thrust necessary to generate lift, and without it, like we as a human species, we're dependent on international aviation to a certain extent, and so it is really difficult. The technological component, and I keep breaking down into the 4 pillars that ICAO has set out in terms of their framework. The technological efficiency, operational efficiency, sustainable aviation fuels, and carbon credits. The first three are really inherently difficult. Airlines work so incredibly hard on the operational efficiency, things like routing and just e-taxiing, so removing burning fuels at on the ground, from turning on the engines, etc., whilst idle, etc., right? Reducing weight, all this sort of stuff. The technological efficiencies are now at the OEMs, right? The original equipment manufacturers, right? And they're trying to reduce the weight of the engines, of the actual bodies, et cetera, et cetera. But nonetheless, they're incremental, improvements over time. And fleets take 20 to 25 years to kind of rotate. Like, these are expensive vehicles, basically. And so those yield very minimal kind of gains, and they're completely, I think, negated by the growth in emissions, right? The growth in travel for the airlines. So those are difficult. So that leaves the other two, which is sustainable aviation fuels, and the industry really focuses on that to scale, and it's a really important pillar. Don't get me wrong, but I think we've got some issues, right? The imperative is there, but SAF is crucial, but the production costs of just they remain incredibly
Yeah.
high, and 2 to 4 times, somewhere in that, the 2 to 3, 2 to 4 times more expensive than traditional jet fuel, poses a really big spread. Like that delta is really significant,
Yeah.
and it requires investment. But then the problem is that airlines they don't have very strong balance sheets, and so it's kind of like what happens in carbon, right? Financiers say, okay, we'll step in and we'll provide the financing necessary to ensure that we can start to scale the production of SAF, but we need guaranteed offtakes with commitment and firm minimums. But the airlines, they're not in a position to do that oftentimes, because the uncertainty with regards to price and the fairly uncertain environment in terms of competition, and that competition bit is a real key one, right? Effectively, an airline increasing their SAF consumption, if their competitors don't, we're effectively placing a levy on themselves and become less competitive in a razor thin margin environment. But effectively, back to the financing, airlines prefer these up to volume agreements, which are essentially variable. So that makes it difficult from a volumetric perspective. Then you got pricing and then credit issues with regards to structuring deal flow, and there's very little investment that going into developing new sources of SAF. So
Yeah.
where I think it breaks down in terms of the reality of these goals, to come back to your question, is many airlines have commitments from, they're currently 1.5% of their total fuel mix is coming from SAF. And by 2030, they set a 10% goal to reach with regards to SAF. But I don't see that actually scaling in that short time frame.
Yeah. 5 years.
And I
It's
think
crazy.
I just don't see
crazy.
that happening. Steph, what's your thoughts on that one, sir?
Yeah, I think this gets back to, in my opinion, a lot of stuff around sustainability, which is like ultimately who's paying for it in the cases that there are premium, and in a lot of cases, until certain things scale and get to a price where it could potentially be parity with the traditional product, whatever that is, it's a question on like, where is the money coming from? Like, who is going to fund it? And I think, Rene, you kind of touched on this. So like financing, like how is that going to work, especially in a newer industry, to like get the funds to support these organizations and then really get the sustainable aviation fuel scaled. And then hopefully at that point at a cost that's comparable, close to comparable with jet fuel, because otherwise I think you don't want to be in a place, I think this is true in sustainability, where for the rest of time, something is the sustainable solution is going to be more expensive. So I think across the board in sustainability, I think it's what we struggle with a lot is sort of like building the business case, like what's good for the planet, how can it be good for business? Are there policies that sort of help policy, whether that's a mandate or an incentive that kind of helps that along? But how does that work in the short term to kind of move technology towards our net zero goal? And then over the long term, like what does that look like to make the business case and make sustainability actually sustainable in the long term?
Yeah. Steph, from an economics perspective, that makes so much sense, right? Like that gap, that delta between Jet A, so kerosene, and the SAF is really significant. Obviously, I'm talking my own book here, right? So I want to get your perspective on this, having been one of the largest buyers on the carbon side, but specifically as it relates to pricing the externality, effectively traditional jet plus the carbon component versus a SAF component, right? Obviously, SAF's not 100%, zero emissions, but it's significantly lower than the traditional jet, right? But having a higher carbon price effectively helps to close that gap and makes SAF a lot more like investable. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've a lot of companies have these conversations about carbon pricing, like how do we essentially like add that so it's not just costs associated with the business, but adding, I think it's just tough to really kind of integrate that and get that integrated into the business where you're not
On a
just thinking
voluntary
about,
basis,
like,
I completely get, but I'm more kind of leaning towards a compliance market, because essentially on a voluntary basis, you've always got the folks that then decide not to do it, and then effectively they just outcompete the folks that are putting on that internal price, and so it's a zero sum game. But in a compliance scenario like Corsia, for example, right? What do you think? What do you think of what that market could potentially do to help to stimulate SAF? If the price starts to climb, in dollar terms, to be able to close that gap.
I mean, I still think, for a lot of these organizations, it's going to be a business thing. So I have to meet X, Y, and Z for compliance, whether that's a percent or like a certain amount of emissions. So then you kind of look like, are we able to do it? Like, what are the ways we can do it? We can do it with SAF, which is more, like internal. I don't want to call it an inset, but it's like tied to your business and, like what you can do within your business to reduce emissions and then address whatever compliance mechanism you need to comply with. And then there are, other market-based measures such as offsets or Corsia compliance credits that you can do. So I still, at the end of the day, it comes down to the business case for it. Like, are there ways we're working with SAF producers, or are there ways we're working with like offsets or Corsia compliance, like what makes most sense at the end of the day? And I don't think it's always like just looking at the number, because I think there are ways to say like we're looking at SAF for the longer term. I think there is a way for us to kind of invest in this and bring this back into compliance and like tell the longer story. But unfortunately, everything at the end of the day, it's what's the cost, and
What's
maybe
economically viable?
what's economically
Yeah.
agree. And then I think there's a little bit, I think, Rene, to your point on like, okay, if we have to do compliance, that is a forced premium on whatever the product is, because we're going to have to comply one way or another. Does that forced premium at the lowest cost help, sell the economics for SAF, which might be a little bit more, but now the premium is not as much because we've already had to bake in, a certain premium for complying with
Yeah.
what mechanism.
And this is what we're seeing with this SAF certificate market, right? So this whole coalition, with Microsoft and other big tech corporates, basically coming in, partnering up with the airlines to cover that green premium of conventional jet fuel and then SAF, right? And that's what this SAF certificate is, right? It's the environmental attribute that's being sold and taken away from the SAF to corporates to reduce their scope 3 travel.
So, Steph, can you sorry to jump in there, Eddie, but Steph, can you clarify that for a lot of folks? Because I know that people will be listening and they'll hear SAF-C and as a SAF certificate, but be confused around how that is accounted for essentially from a scope 1 and 3 basis. So can you break it down around this kind of book and claim, the scope 1 attribute and then the scope 3 attribute? And then ultimately the question I think about is what can corporates that are obviously flying on for business do to help to support the uptake of SAF by the airlines? Effectively, like your question around who pays. In this case, my premise is the corporate pays. Can you take me through that?
Okay, yeah. So essentially, I think maybe the easiest way to think about this is there's fuel that's going to go onto an airplane to fly that airplane. And the airline is going to account for that fuel in their scope 1 emissions. Like, that's part of their operations. They need X amount of fuel to fly. So take out the corporate for a second. If we're talking about targets or reducing environmental impact, the airline will need to think about what are the things I can do to reduce our scope 1 emissions and SAF. So if I'm able to use SAF, the impact from jet fuel will be reduced based on however much SAF I use. So for every corporate passenger that is on that airplane, that same fuel, the same amount of fuel, is going to be part of that corporate's scope 3 emissions from their business travel. And so essentially every gallon, every amount of fuel on an airplane is attributed to an airline as scope 1 and a customer as scope 3. Some of it is going to be corporate customers, some of it is going to be cargo customers, and some of it will just be individual leisure travelers. So there's going to be two places it accounts for all of the fuel. So with sustainable aviation fuel, the thought here is with these SAF certificates, every gallon or every unit of sustainable aviation fuel that is purchased and paid for by an airline essentially can help address the airline's scope 1 emissions, and then the SAF-C credit can also, in theory, address a corporate customer's scope 3 emissions, because we're still talking about the same fuel. Like, it was the same fuel that went onto an airplane. The accounting is just one is for scope 1 for an airline, and then for scope 3 for the corporate customer or the cargo customer or an individual customer. So I think the goal here is really to be able to say, if we're able to co-invest, there is going to be a premium with SAF, but if the corporate customer can kind of come together, the corporate customer pays the premium, we've essentially reduced emissions from that flight. And those that are involved, so from an accounting perspective, so the airline and then the corporate customer should be able to take credit via that SAF-C to reduce their relevant emissions.
Yeah, well said. And it signals long-term demand for by structuring offtakes, et cetera, right? And this is similar to what we saw with scope 2, which is emissions from electricity consumption with renewable energy certificates, right? And I mean, in the 70s and 80s, when renewable technologies first came to market, like solar and wind, they were incredibly expensive, right? And because of the REC market, it was able to drive down costs. And now, renewable energy is, some of the lowest cost of capital electricity you can get, and it's very straightforward. The way you can mitigate your scope 2 due to REC. So I see scope 3. The solution is SAF-C for business travel, obviously, which is, I think, category 6 or 15. But yeah, I mean, the scope 1 emission, if an airline buys and burns the SAF, it can claim the emissions reduction in scope 1, which is direct. But if it sells the SAF certificate to another party, it cannot claim that scope 1 reduction. Right. So I think there's also the difference between
they can.
No, it's the
if
same
it sells
fuel.
the fully scope. So the fully scoped SAF-C is scope 1 and 3.
And 3. But you're talking about
you could
decoupling it.
You can that's what they're working on now, is decoupling the environmental attribute from scope 1 and scope 3. So, that they can.
But you really need that. Like, to me, it just appears like it's leverage, right? That corporates can, because let's just face it, corporates struggle with their scope 3 emissions. They just do across their entire supply chains. And now, just in this one category of aviation, whether it's just business aviation, international, domestic, by supporting the airline's ability to purchase the physical SAF molecules into the plane, actually helps them to mitigate their scope 3. So it's the most logical approach, and it actually, it won't cost that much more, right, for the corporate seat, because it's amortized over the individual kind of ticket. I think that helps the airlines who just will struggle to absorb this cost themselves. They just won't.
I would say, well,
but what do they need to incentivize? Like, what you talk about business cases, Steph, like, and we talked about this, personally, like when we caught up recently in Singapore. There needs to be some sort of tacit endorsement for corporates to be able to recognize in their own accounting these environmental attribute certificates. Let's put carbon to the side for a second. Let's just talk SAF-C. Like, what does it need to be? What does it need to happen within, like, an SBTI framework for an EAC to be
Yeah.
recognized?
So, we've definitely talked about this, but I think many corporates have kind of coalesced around science-based targets, which I think kind of rely on greenhouse gas protocol on like how to set short, medium, long-term climate targets, and then essentially like how to track progress. So I think with SAFC and I think with carbon and anything else, it's kind of giving that market signal to say like something like that or something like a SAFC is sufficient to be able to show progress on your actual ledger. Because I think for a lot of companies, what you kind of look at is, okay, we have this target to reduce X amount or to hit net zero. The way we're tracking progress is on that accounting and greenhouse gas ledger. So if we're talking about business cases, the answer is always going to be like, what are the things we can do that's going to start reducing that ledger like this year over time, et cetera. And if whatever the product is, if the SAFC, if insets, offsets, et cetera, don't count towards that ledger, it just makes the business case so much more difficult because like we're going to be investing X amount of money to work towards reducing emissions or maybe even actually reducing emissions directly. But if it's not showing up on your ledger, then it's just a little bit harder with, okay, our emissions are actually still staying the same. We can maybe just talk like broadly about the story. So ultimately, I think it's alignment on like these various reporting, not even like reporting requirements, but these frameworks and getting agreement on like what are the pragmatic levers, or maybe not what are the pragmatic levers, but what are the levers and things that we can do to address emissions, and then pragmatically and realistically, how does that show up in a corporate's ledger? How do you actually show numerical progress?
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Very well said. And I think on the topic of scope 3, I think this is a good time to shift over to our next story. But now I just want to mention, so I was in San Francisco for Climate Week last week, and scope 3, so scope 3 emissions, indirect in your supply chain, was the number one topic amongst corporates that were there, right? There was a ton of sessions on scope 3 decarbonization, and it's clear that this is the hardest area to tackle for corporates, right? You have your scope 2, your electricity, pretty straightforward. Your scope 1, internal reductions, cutting waste. But scope 3 is a whole different ballgame, right? And for people, for our audience listening that may not know what falls under scope 3 categories, you have purchased goods and services, capital goods, fuel and energy related activities, upstream transportation and distribution, waste generated in operation, the processing of sold productions, investments, franchises, downstream leased assets, end of life treatment of sold products, use of sold products, business travel. I mean, the list goes on and on. So, and for most corporates, I think on average, 75%, I saw this statistic somewhere, but I don't know from where, but on average, 75% of a company's emissions come from their scope 3. It varies obviously widely from sector to sector, but on aggregate, scope 3 is the highest source of emissions, right? So it brings up a very good debate, and I think what VCMI is doing is a good stance for the industry. So I want to get into this story here that was on Bloomberg the
Wait,
day.
before we do that, can I ask on SF Climate Week,
Yeah.
what was like the big discussion around scope 3? Like what to do to
Well,
reduce
okay,
or like,
so yeah, that's a good that's the billion-dollar question. You're like, what's going on with scope 3?
yeah,
Um,
what were the
so what
discussions?
I'm seeing is corporates are actively engaging with their suppliers and trying to work with them. So I would say there's a couple of different factors. Number one is in setting, right?
Mhm.
Corporates like to invest in what they can understand, right? So if you're a steel company and you're going to invest in some avoided deforestation project in Africa, the CFO is gonna be like, oh, okay, compared to a steel project, carbon capture on a steel plant in India, it's much more easy to sell that case internally because it's kind of an insetting project, right? But so insetting, working with their suppliers. So it seems that the corporates are struggling to get their suppliers to decarbonize because their suppliers are the ones with the high emissions and they fall within their scope 3 category, and they can't directly, tell them what to do, but they can work with them to mitigate and reduce their emissions. And we're seeing some companies actually purchase offsets and then give them to their suppliers, and then have their suppliers have it retired on their behalf to lower those emissions, and then that overall will lower their scope 3.
Yeah.
So we're seeing this kind of collaboration with the corporate. Let's say you have a Costco or you have a Salesforce. They have a ton of companies within their supply chain that they need to work with on this, or else their scope 3 emissions won't be reduced, right? And that's what we're seeing, and it's very difficult to do that. I was at there was a good panel on scope 3 decarbonization, and they had a large corporate, and then they had a couple of their suppliers with them, and this is what they're actively talking about, right? Like 1 year we're going to purchase 100% of offsets for them, and the next year it's going to be 70-30, and the next year it's going to be 50-50, and then it's going to get to a point where the supplier is fully investing in carbon removals. So that's a
Yeah.
hot topic.
Which
But
is like
it's
that's exactly like the SAFC, like the corporate customers needing to reduce scope
mhm.
3 category 6 or whatever it is.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
like
Because
how
it's the
are you
Can
corporates.
I just, but
Yeah.
like, can I just ask a question here on this? Because like, we talk about supply chains as like an esoteric thing. Okay, let's just imagine you're in apparel, right? Like, pick your favorite brand, right? They have outsourced their manufacturing through a really distributed and diffused supply chain, right? So someone will make the glue, someone will make someone will make the shoe bit and the laces, and like it's really like distributed. Take automotive. I interviewed Climate Impact Partners CEO Sherry a couple of years back at COP, and she came from General Motors, right? And then she worked at GE, and she said that when she was at General Motors had 30,000 suppliers.
Yep.
30,000, right? So how do you actually even start those conversations to help your suppliers and your suppliers and suppliers basically start to decarbonize, right? Like how do you apply leverage? How do you either select for low carbon suppliers? How do you provide incentives to them? How do you actually engage them in a dialogue to help you to decarbonize your scope 3 emissions? So that's the question. And then, so Steph, can you like relate
Yeah.
that to us from your professional experience? Because I know, I mean, you've worked in aviation, notoriously hard to abate sector, and now you're in food and ag, right? Like also really difficult to
suppliers,
decarbonize. Yeah.
Yeah.
So can you walk us through that kind of
Yeah,
conundrum?
for sure. So, like I think you said GM had 30,000 suppliers or something like that. And I think probably most large companies, if you tally up all the suppliers, it's a huge list. So I think one thing is,
Actually, I think I remember the number. She said GE, she had 30,000. At GM, General Motors, she had
oh
100,000
my gosh,
suppliers.
yeah. So it's a lot. So I think a couple things is, I think when you're looking at your supply chain, you're going to have to start somewhere. Like, what are the categories that we care about to begin with? Like, you're not going to be able to start with everything. So what are the most material categories, or maybe not even the most material categories? Like, where do we really need to make progress because there's a large environmental impact? So like, shrink the 30,000 and shrink the 100,000 down to something a little more manageable by category. And then even within the categories, it's okay, so let's take just the top. I think it's always 80-20 rule. Let's, 80% of our supply or 80% of our volume is made up by only a handful or 20-30 suppliers. So maybe that's where we actually begin. Look at those suppliers, one, do they have climate targets that are aligned, either science-based targets or climate targets that are aligned with where we want to go. So if your supplier has targets that are aligned with where you want to go, then you kind of understand at least like we're going on the same path. Like they are taking action within their organization to reduce emissions, like kind of look at what levers are available and things like that. And then with the ones that maybe don't quite have targets yet, you know, the action there might be like, how can we maybe help you along? Like, can we have conversations about measuring your emissions in the hopes that like that kind of turns into a climate target and we're all moving towards something by 2030 or something by 2050. And then I think from there, you will always, I think, still have to focus on the most material and figure out like where are the biggest areas where I can make an impact working with suppliers. And then the question is like, are there maybe pilot programs we can work together on? Like, let's test something to see how we can address emissions together, like something shared together, and say, we're going to do this program. We might put some money in, you might put some money in. And then after a year, after 2 years, we'll see that, oh, this is what worked really well. We're actually seeing emissions reductions that can show up on our ledger. This is what hasn't really worked. So let's go ahead and continue to kind of refine and get that right. Ultimately, I think at the end of all of this, it's looking to see what are those big levers that can be pulled within each of these subcategories in your supply chain. What are the levers that can be pulled? Like how much do they end up impacting? And then the biggest question is, who's paying for this? So in a lot of cases, if it's, you know, something that's not technology ready, the open question is, okay, we know we over time want to get to this certain place where this becomes business as usual, or we're doing this more often, or the product becomes more efficient, but it's not quite there yet. So, you know, does the customer, like in the case of SAFC, do we kind of support from a monetary perspective upfront to say, like, we know it's not at scale, we know it's more expensive right now, but here's the signal to help, you know, get to the point where this can be business as usual and SAF is a large proportion over time. So I think with all of it, you know, there's a lot of finding your most material suppliers, figuring out, you know, who's kind of already on the journey and whether there's additional pilot programs you can do to move that forward maybe a little bit faster. And then also like, how do we build the business case for the long term?
That's great. Thank you for that summary. That makes a lot of sense. And it just breaks down a really complex problem into bite-sized pieces. So that's really great. Can I just reflect on one quick thing to that approach, but also just to do your early kind of framing, Eddie, around, you know, VCMI came out with this Scope 3 action
Yeah.
code practice a couple of days ago, right? And I don't think that the market has digested it fully, but one of the things I really liked was this kind of dual approach to emission reductions where they basically encourage companies to continue the direct decarbonization efforts. That you just highlighted that process and you kind of broke it down into logical step by step. But they have this encouragement to continue to the direct decarbonization whilst retiring high quality carbon credits to compensate for the emissions that are currently difficult to abate. So effectively saying, continue to do the direct, you know, reductions and do them as fast as you can. And as you know, like Stephanie said, who's going to pay for them and how do you distribute that accordingly? But you're undoubtedly going to have like, you know, emissions that are difficult to abate or you know, residuals, and you need to address those today. So I really like that approach, and it kind of sets the framework. And then obviously their end to end is connected to ICBCM, right? So you have the integrity component and then the substantiation of the claims. I really like that.
Yeah, well, let me jump in there and set the scene for that story, because there was a big article that came out on Bloomberg a few days ago regarding this, you know, VCMI's new Scope 3 carbon credit guidance, right? So the VCMI, for our audience, the Voluntary Carbon Markets Integrity Initiative, has launched its Scope 3 action code of practice. So it's offering, like Rene said, offering companies a structured way to use carbon credits to close the emissions gap in their value chains through 2040, right? And under the new guidance, companies can use high quality credits approved by the ICVCM, which sets a bar on quality and transparency and scientific rigor, for up to 25% of their scope 3 emissions in a given year, right? Provided they meet some key criteria, which includes maintaining an inventory, an emissions inventory, disclosing near-term science-aligned targets, and publicly reporting financial and policy alignment with the Paris Agreement. And the VCMI argues that this approach provides a pragmatic pathway to decarbonization by keeping businesses engaged rather than sidelining them over unattainable targets, which is what we've seen this past year, right? Like this is happening at a time when corporate climate ambition is wavering. We saw HSBC and others have cited unclear guidance around carbon credit use, and they use that as a reason to delay net zero targets and take a step back from their emissions. And this is
They
at a
didn't
time
just
where,
delay it, Eddie. It was egregious and a lack of leadership. They pushed it back by 20 years.
well, there we go. Yeah, they pushed it back by
Kick the
20
can.
years. It's everyone's fault but mine, et cetera, et cetera. That could be a whole nother podcast, but
Eddie's, yeah.
yeah, at ease. But yeah, I mean, this is at a time, the VCMI estimates that there's a 1.4 gigaton gap in scope 3 progress expected to grow 5 times by 2030, right? And the UK government has welcomed the VCMI's approach as a clear and appropriate role, but this doesn't come without the typical debate. There's always a debate with something in the climate space because you have a wide variety of actors on different sides, right? So NGOs and other analysts argue it could lower ambition, mislead investors, and let laggards hide behind offsets rather than make real operational cuts.
I think
When
that's bullshit. Let's just call it out. It's a fallacy because the companies, and Stephanie, you highlighted this earlier, the companies that actually are taking voluntary action, there's a perversity. They're actually doing that and they're demonstrating leadership, but then they get called out, which is the most perverse kind of thing
Yeah.
of all time, right?
Yes.
Like the
It's
ones
the
who are actually taking the
paradox.
lead, they get it's this paradox, and then they get called out for doing something, and then it creates the actual the fallacy of that kind of stance, right? That NGOs fear that the folks will be hiding behind the offsets. That's bullshit, right? The more competition there is for the carbon credits, we see the prices increasing. We've seen already a dress rehearsal of this in 2021 and 22, right?
Yeah.
And to an extent in 2020. And that created even more and more action, right? And more incentive for companies to decarbonize internally because it actually raised the cost
Yeah.
of meeting their voluntary commitments. So it's actually not the case.
Yeah.
Definitely not.
I think,
And so you want to dive in here, Stephanie?
yeah, I think I was definitely going to touch on that, Rene, which is you have both heard me talk about this time and time again, but my personal opinion is at the end of the day, we need all of the tools and all of the levers if we're talking about on a global scale, how we're going to get to net zero and these other climate targets to, get to 1.5 degrees and really avoid catastrophe. So it is not, I think it's great that there are rules in place. And I understand that the rigor around certain things is because like scientifically, that is how urgent and like how much needs to be happen in order to avoid, the worst climate catastrophe. However, like we've talked about on this, like for the past 40 minutes, a lot of technology is just not there. So those solutions are just not available for us to go today and say, like, we're going to reduce X amount. And that's where I think some of these market-based measures or, investing in these high quality credits comes into play to be able to say, we are going to be able to support ending deforestation by 2030. And I think the last I heard, like, that needs to happen by 2030 if we're going to have any shot for our 2050 global climate targets. We need to invest in money, put carbon financing into those projects But while at the same time, we still need to address each sector's, like what technology they need to be able to reduce emissions. Companies need to look at what they can do within their supply chain, within, you know, their kind of four walls in scope 1 and scope 2 to be able to do that. But what is not helpful is shaming or saying like, you were trying to do something, you didn't do it great, so, you know, let's shame you, and that's a terrible thing to do. Because I think it can very quickly, and I think we've seen this over the last couple of years, very quickly go from, we might try something, it may not work, and that's okay, we might pivot, to, you know what, it's just better and it's just easier for me to not do anything because then I won't
Exactly.
get in trouble, X, Y, and Z. Whereas really what we really need to do is look at all the tools in the toolbox. And fine,
Mm.
like there is going to be a hierarchy. Some things are going to be better, some things should be last resort and things like that. But at the end of the day, we just need to do finance and climate fast.
Yeah. Yeah, no, 100%. And I think, look, especially given the political backdrop, right? Like, I think a lot of these NGOs and so-called environmental activists need to understand that these companies don't have to do anything. Like, they don't have to. It's completely voluntary.
Exactly.
So for them saying, oh, it's gonna, it's gonna allow them to continue to emit if they use offsets, or they're not gonna internally reduce their emissions. It's like they don't have to, regardless. So they need to use this market-based mechanism to help their climate ambitions, right? And to meet their climate goals, right? And I think, especially given the political backdrop, right? I mean, we're seeing things unfold in the US now. We're going to be pulling a lot more fossil carbon out of the ground. So it just makes the case, it's ever more clear that we need to be taking carbon out of the atmosphere and sticking it in the ground. And that's just a fact. But
Yeah.
yeah, definitely.
I completely emphatically, I want to give you an exclamation point on that point, Eddie. But can I ask a question that kind of goes back to something that Stephanie said, and I'll tie in the NGO piece. But y- actually, what's the dialogue that exists between NGOs and corporate sustainability teams? Because oftentimes I think it's actually really constructive, right? There is some
Um,
obviously criticisms that might be not encouraging, let's put it that way. And I think that the this kind of you know paradox around inaction, right, and targeting leaders in this space is actually a factor of the media taking sound bites and talking points from specific, very vociferous NGOs. But let's kind of just bring it back to the broader kind of environmental NGOs like the Nature Conservancy, EDF, and others who are really constructive. What from your corporate experience, Steph? Like, what is the conversation like with those folks? I believe I believe it would be really constructive. Can we shut
I
that out?
mean, I would say like probably in more recent times, a lot of these conversations, at least the ones that I've been speaking to, they are on the side of pragmatism. So I think, you know, there do have to be rules in place. I think you would probably lean towards potentially like more rules than maybe not more rules, but like it's not going to go in the way of like, sure, get whatever credits, and then you can apply that to your reduction target and your lead
Yeah,
and things like
stringency and
that.
integrity for sure.
Yes, there is going to be rules, but I think there is the door is open for kind of thinking through maybe what are the ways we can have one set of rules between now and 2030, scale that back between the 2030 to 2040, and then kind of move towards just removals or whatever it is to get us where we need by 2050. So I think I agree with you. There is, I'm sure I can't say it's true for everyone, but I think there are going to be a lot of NGOs and just a lot of people that you talk to in different sectors that have the same mindset that what we really need to do is act fast and not let perfect be the enemy of the good. And if you're not doing perfectly, then you've completely failed. And that's
mm.
cool.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and
very
I
well.
think that's honest, right? Like we've seen IKEA, and I think Brennan Spelisi from Patch talked about that a couple of weeks back, right? IKEA came out with this campaign where they had this ambition to effectively decarbonize their fleet emissions, and they just said, we didn't make it. We didn't make it in the target that we self set or self imposed, but we got pretty close, and we're going to continue the investment, and we're going to continue this trajectory to do the hard work to decarbonize internally. And I thought that was just a really honest campaign. They had a really wonderful ad around it that kind of showed the progress and then kind of the reverse of the kind of their vehicles kind of going in reverse direction, showing the kind of the difficulty of achieving this goal that they self-imposed. But I think what's been lacking is the applause, right? Like, or recognition
Mm,
from broader civil society, from other stakeholders, to really recognize how difficult it is for corporates. You said it, Eddie. A lot of the corporates, they don't have an obligation to do this thing publicly, but we've been really fortunate to work with clients. Uh, I had the privilege of working with Stephanie and her team at Delta for many, many years, and I got to see that firsthand. It's really incredible what these companies do, the kind of budget that they set for these types of initiatives,
yeah.
and the kind of audacious goals that they set. Delta set this carbon neutral growth commitment in 2013, right? Ahead of what Corsia was, right? By many, many years. And then helped others in the industry actually see that it was possible by seeing the largest airline in the world setting
Mm,
this, offset sort of floor, and then the growth above that. And then in 2020, they went one step further, and then they offset emissions below that line. And we saw a real proliferation of these commitments, and then it became non-fashionable because of the criticisms that then came their way. And to Steph's point, it's a criticism that is baseless. It's based on, oh, it's not perfect, therefore it's out. And the real world is just a really difficult place to operate in. And when you have to engage with various different stakeholders, and you have to operate within the various different climates politically, right? And then you have a myriad of different regulations. It's just a really difficult thing to be doing.
mm,
And if it's not constructive, or you're not getting recognition for it, oftentimes it gets cut.
mm.
And we've seen that happen. And that perversity just astonishes me that
Yeah.
we're there.
We're
Yeah.
like on the same page. We're on the same team here. Like everybody needs
Yeah.
and my favorite like little, I don't know where I heard this, maybe one of you guys told me this, but climate and sustainability is the world's biggest group project. Like everybody should be going in the same direction and everybody needs to contribute. And it's probably a little bit chaotic as a group project, like we all know from school, but we can't do this without everybody, one, without everybody participating, and two, without everybody being on the same page that like we need to do everything to kind of propel us to where we need to get to and not, you know, basically stop us with
100%, 100%. We need to stop shooting ourselves in the foot and recognize that we're all on the same team, right? And I think it's unfortunate because you have these corporate sustainability teams that put in hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of hours of effort and their time into this hard work in decarbonizing their supply chains and their internal emissions. And then what do they get? When things are going well, they don't get really applauded for it. It's silent. They only get criticism, which is unfortunate to see, right? Because
They
you
get
have
accused of
industry,
greenwashing, Eddie,
they get
right?
accused
And
of
then
yeah,
that.
that's the
oftentimes the
thing
guys
here.
that have
Wow.
got exactly, that's it. Thank you. And then the guys that are really have the conviction, now they just do the hushing. They just still do it, but they don't sing it from the
Yeah.
rooftops.
But
It's like,
meanwhile, you have these industries, these hydrocarbon industries, or mining, and which are all which are essential parts of the economy, but they actively destroy the earth, right? Some of these projects, and there are a lot of major mistakes. I mean, look what happened about a decade ago with the BP oil spill, right? And the market's still thriving, right? Like it's oil, but so it's fine to criticize projects that are actively trying to improve the world, but projects that actively destroy it, that's totally fine. So that's like that paradox that we find ourselves in. But yeah, I want to
yeah,
be conscious of Stephanie's time, and
Damn,
I think I like what you said about the corporate teams not losing sight of in the next, 1 to 2 years of what's really important, that we're all, on the same team. But, and I think zooming out, as the landscape around net zero targets and the offset market, both voluntary and compliance keeps shifting. What's one thing you think, sustainability teams can't afford to lose sight of in the next, 2 to 3 years, as we come to near-term targets, 5 years away, 2030, 10 years, 2035, and then 25 years we're in net zero. It's going to go by like that. So, what's one thing you think sustainability teams should not lose sight of in the present moment with all the noise around what's happening?
I think it's continuing, like a lot of these sustainability teams will already have short-term, medium-term, and long-term targets set in place. I think it's not continuing to do the actions that you probably already had on the way already. And so whatever the levers were that you were kind of evaluating, keep going on those. And then really try to find the ones that help the business case. So, as cost of energy goes up, like I think, the business case for renewable energy might change, like really try to lean into where you can get buy-in from other teams internally, and where you can really build the business case where you're going to start saving a little bit of money. And I think even in some cases, like lean into the regulation. I know that sounds weird saying, but like if you have the regulation, like use that as a way to kind of propel things forward. Like we have to do X, Y, and Z because of regulation. Is there a way we can go, a little bit further? I think the environment may be hard. There's always going to be ups and downs with hurdles and things like that. But I think just
Yeah.
continuing what we're doing and making sure.
Do you think the hurdles internally are the most difficult for corporates to get through, right? Because I've heard that, I've seen that things move very slow within a large corporate because of all the different teams that have to put a stamp on it, right? They don't move quickly like a nimble startup
Yeah.
would, right? So some of the biggest hurdles I've heard is actually getting just internal, stakeholder engagement and getting, like you said, getting the business case across the board and getting stuff approved. That's like one of the hardest things to overcome for these teams. Would you say? Would you say so?
I think that's definitely up there. And I think you will probably find in a lot of sustainability organizations that a fair part of the job is influence and like going to the relevant teams and figuring out how to influence supply chain, how to influence finance, how to work together with different teams. And I think
Yeah.
that's a really great point for the next few years as we're coming up on 2030. Things with the market may be shifting a little bit, like we may be seeing some changes, but there's always going to be, I think, things that we can do around, like, there are always going to be small things we can do, like figure
Yeah.
out the ways
Yeah.
where it can make sense economically, like
Yeah.
take the small
Cutting waste.
steps.
And,
Exactly.
part of
There
it's
are
just cutting waste and saving money.
exactly like be more efficient. That's actually going to save
Yeah,
money, and then you can kind of build the business cases for bigger and better on top of that.
definitely. So anything exciting happening on your end the next few months, few years? What's going on in the ag space here in you focus in the
Um,
mainly?
I think for me, I think the big. What did you say?
I'm just laughing. I'm just like, okay, I'm keen to hear.
Okay, so
What's happening in the ag space? I love that question, Eddie.
yeah, I think for us,
Good.
a lot of it is actually, we are subject to a lot of EU regulation. So that's a lot of disclosure regulation, but like kind of like I said earlier, you kind of lean in on that a little bit. Like use having the EU regulation means we will have to engage certain teams internally on just like how we comply with that regulation. Like that's kind of the starting point for having discussions on, okay, now what can we do around like working with our key suppliers around food? What can we do working with our franchisees to reduce emissions from restaurants and things like that? So I think there's a lot more to come. Like we have some pretty hefty targets and things like that. So we're just continuing to engage people around the company, our franchisees, our suppliers, to just make progress towards those goals.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, yeah, I forgot to ask. So do you think that the EU is, you work with the EU suppliers in ag and then here in the US, are they poisoning our food here in the US or not? What's the debate around that, Are you gonna disappear if you tell us about it?
Don't
No, I'm
answer
just
that
kidding.
question. That's
You don't have to
ridiculous.
answer that question.
Oh,
I
wow,
don't
got this.
don't answer that question. I don't want to see you disappear at some point.
We
Uh,
love Steph. Take care of
but
her already.
I've been disappeared.
yeah, I mean, that's what everyone says in Europe. Oh, the Americans, your food has chemicals.
Eddie, when did we get to this point of listening to these kind of tin hat foil ideas and things? Come on, just keep it moving.
No, we're wrapping it up. I just wanted to put her on the spot there, but I was just kidding because
You said you
I know.
weren't going to.
I know.
That's right.
Actually, Rene probably put you on the spot a lot more than I did here because he likes. But yeah, no, I think with that, I think we can wrap things here,
Yeah,
right?
I'll put Steph on the spot. Hey, Steph, who can we get on the podcast from the corporate world? Can you nominate some folks after
Ooh,
the
oh my
show?
gosh, I'm not gonna
Yeah.
do this on the spot, but yeah, let me get
No,
Some
no.
folks on the
He already
spot
asked
right
Let's come
now.
back to us, please.
Eddie already asked me
We can
this,
put it
so-
on LinkedIn and we put them on the spot publicly.
All right,
So
let's do that when we wrap
Okay.
recording, Eddie.
So Rohini,
Thanks, Steph. Really appreciate you. Rohini Sengupta, you're invited. Yeah, anytime.
Yeah, Rene, you got to join. Talk about
That's
what's
it.
going on in United. No, but
yeah.
yeah. Well, Steph, thanks so much for joining. Really appreciate
Yeah,
it.
thank you.
Always a fun time with you.
Always a fun time. Thanks for
And
having me.
yeah,
Thanks for joining us, Steph. Good to see you.
our audience, I hope you
Patient,
enjoyed
Rene.
it. Definitely.
Yeah, no, you actually where I'm saying is amazing. You should see the beach here.
You're not gonna
It's
let me
a little
close
bit
it
like
out.
that.
No, close us out.
I'm kidding. It's like, comment, subscribe, all of it. No, gotta get that in there.
Get that in there. Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Love it.
Take care.
Talk to y'all
Bye.
soon.